get to talk with you all today about the museum and some Southern Jewish history. I'm just going to share my screen really fast to get us started today. Then, awesome. Thanks for everybody's patience. So I like to start all these Zooms with a bit of housekeeping because I think it's just nice to get it out of the way. Oh, sorry. This is what I was trying to hold. So as Jessica said, I do really, with a group this size, if you're comfortable asking questions, you can either chat them or you can ask them. I'll have 2 specific times, perhaps 3 times where I ask for questions. But if a question comes up during chat, during conversation, chat it and I'll come back to it on chat. That being said, besides those times, it's really helpful if everyone stays on mute, just so you can hear me and the presentation. And if something doesn't look right, the PowerPoint doesn't seem to be matching what I'm talking about, or you stop hearing me altogether, feel free to come off mute and say, hey, Lizzie, wait, we can't hear you. That way I'll be able to figure out the tech issue. So that being said, I like to start these conversations with a question for you. So we're going to do some Southern Jewish trivia. And we're going to do it in 2 ways. One, you can add the A, B, C answer to the chat, or you can do what I do when I play Jeopardy, which is just yell at the screen, on mute, of course. So my first question is, which city had the first synagogue outside of the original 13 colonies? Is it A, Savannah, B, Mobile, or C, New Orleans?
A.
So this one is this one's so tricky because it's outside of the original 13 colonies, and Georgia was an original colony, so it's a tricky question. But the answer is C, New Orleans.
C. Oh.
C, New Orleans. So what is now known as Turo Synagogue was founded in 1828 in New Orleans, just 25 years after the Louisiana Purchase. Turo Synagogue congregation was a result from a union between 2 original congregations, Congregation Gates of Mercy and Congregation Dispersed of Judah, which became Shangarai Eset, which is Gates of Mercy, and it was founded in 1828. And it was later renamed Turo Synagogue after the merchant philanthropist Judah Turo, and he was the son of Isaac Turo, who is the leader of the Rhode Island synagogue named for him. So there are 2 Turo synagogues. One is in New Orleans, one is in Rhode Island. And this tricky question got us to New Orleans. So the next one, I'll read it. Which African-American musician was taken in by a Jewish family at the age of 7 and given his first musical instrument? Was it A, Jelly Roll Morton, B, Louis Armstrong, or C, Buddy Bolton?
Louis Armstrong, B.
Awesome. It was Louis. So Louis Armstrong was taken, the Karnofsky family of New Orleans employed young Louis, and he was collecting refuse such as bottles and rags in New Orleans, and helped him buy his first cornet. Armstrong wore a Jewish star necklace around his neck as an expression of gratitude for the Karnofsky family that helped him as a youngster. Okay, so that's a little bit of Southern Jewish history trivia. Now let's see what other Jewish trivia we can pick up in the next little bit of time together. And I like to start with a little bit of the museum. Why are we here? What is the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience? And then we'll talk about Southern Jewish history. So the museum is a successor museum that was originally founded in 1986 at Harry S. Jacobs Camp in Utica, Mississippi, which is part of the Union of Reform Judaism's camping movement. So Utica is a small rural town about 45 minutes outside of Jackson, Mississippi, which is the capital. But if you're like, Utica, Jackson, where is that? Great question. It was pretty inaccessible to most people because it's this town kind of off the beaten path. And it was an active summer camp, and it continues to be an active summer camp. So it posed some security issues for people who are interested in seeing the museum, and then also some access issues. So in 2012, the museum was officially closed at Jacobs, and a volunteer of board members looked for places where the museum could be rehoused to reach the most people. And New Orleans was chosen, which is where I am right now, New Orleans, Louisiana, because of its high tourist traffic, and also didn't already have a Jewish museum. So since opening, despite the challenges of COVID, we've had thousands of guests come into our doors in just May 27th of last year. And our tagline, Shalom, make yourself at home, underscores our vision for the museum as a place where people can come together comfortably and have conversation and learn with one another. So the museum tells 300 plus years of the Southern Jewish experience, and we work to tell it through a variety of viewpoints. We talk about these bigger historical narratives that mirror and reflect the experiences of many Americans during these times, as well as these particular stories of place, like in the South, and then individual stories of people at these times. So Southern Jewish history intersects with Southern history and Jewish history, and throughout our galleries, we see this history reflected. So whenever possible, we work to view these bigger themes through these individual stories told through objects, personal narratives, and digital interactives. And we're always looking for more stories to add. So as I go along today, I invite you to consider when your story, the stories you know, your family story, your friend's story, reflect some of the themes you see in the museum. The themes are roughly chronological. We're going to talk in a roughly chronological way. What do I mean by roughly chronological? It doesn't happen exclusively chronologically. So we're going to start with immigration, how and why Jews came to the American South, starting first with port cities and then what drew them into the interior of the country. But we know that Jews continually immigrated and continue to immigrate to the American South. So while we start our museum in this place, it's certainly not the end of that conversation. So we got our themes, and let's start with a timeline to help us ground where we are in history. So we start in 1585 with the first Jew who came to colonial America, whose name was Joaquin Gans, and he came to the Virginia colony on Sir Walter Raleigh's expedition as a metallurgist and mining engineer. As you then can see, in 1654, the first Jew to settle in colonial America did so in New Amsterdam, more than 50 years later. So the story of the Jewish experience actually starts in the American South, in the Virginia colony. And so we like to think about these ideas as we go through and kind of poking through those typical narratives that you hear that all Jews started in the Northeast. Well, wait a second, let's complicate this story. As you can see behind those two pulled out images, our timeline is quite long. And so I'm not going to talk about all these timeline entries, but instead going to pull out two particular stories that help us look at some of the other reasons we tell a certain type of story at the museum. So when the galleries were being designed, they were purposely thinking through ways in which certain perspectives haven't been recorded and focused on in history. So for example, the archives and objects from these time periods, especially the 1800s and earlier, skew towards men, though we know that women were active and engaged decision makers and actors at this time. So by including these stories, we are enriching our understanding of the Southern Jewish experience, while also telling these important perspectives. So let me tell you about Rachel Mordechai Lazarus, daughter of Jacob Mordechai, who opened the Mordechai Female Seminary in North Carolina in 1809. This prestigious school taught needlework and dancing alongside subjects that were often reserved for male pupils, such as mathematics and Latin. Rachel Mordechai Lazarus served as the head instructor of the school and influenced her close friend, Maria Edgeworth, who was an author and writer, to confront anti-Jewish stereotypes in her writing. And then in 1893, the National Council of Jewish Women, America's oldest Jewish women's organization, was established. Hannah Solomon of Illinois founded the NCJW, to address the lack of Jewish education and professional experiences at the time. But from the start, Southern Jews held prominent positions in this organization, including Carrie Simon of Alabama and Jeanette Goldberg of Texas. So from here, we see that Southern Jewish women were active and engaged decision makers, and then also part of this national story, not just this regional story. Okay, so we have a little bit of timeline history. Now let's go into this immigration story. So most Jewish settlers in colonial America, so we're going all the way back to pre-1776, were Sephardic, with many tracing their heritage to Spain and Portugal before the Spanish Inquisition and coming by way of Holland and England and the West Indies. They settled in port cities in the Caribbean and along the eastern seaboard and worked in trading industries. And we see some of the earliest communities forming here, and this is why I know that you all are a knowledgeable group of Jewish historians, because you pointed out Savannah, which is what I'm also going to point out. So Mikveh Israel in Savannah, Georgia, is one of the oldest operating synagogues today, and they were founded by Sephardic immigrants. So while smaller in number, Ashkenazi Jews from Central and Eastern Europe also settled in colonial times, and they brought different religious and cultural traditions with them. And that sometimes resulted in friction in more established Sephardic communities. And you see this transition in a lot of synagogues. A lot of synagogues in the South started as Sephardic synagogues, and then as more Ashkenazi Jews moved, the congregations started following Ashkenazic traditions. Regardless of the time and place when these immigrants moved, they often felt this push to leave their homeland and this pull to come to the United States. So some Sephardic immigrants, like Portuguese Jews, were actually pushed out due to anti-Semitism, and they were drawn to colonial America with the promise of economic mobility. Similarly, Ashkenazi Jews, centuries later, were pushed out of Eastern Europe due to pogroms, civil unrest, and lack of opportunity, but they were pulled by this promise of a better life with reuniting with family who had already come here. And in fact, these reasons that immigrants moved enticed many immigrants throughout these two times, the colonial period, the late 1800s, and even today, this push and pull towards the United States. So when we think about immigrant stories, we're often thinking about these big picture narratives. But one of the things that I love that you get to do with artifacts in a museum is think about individual stories. So if you can see my screen, the Shabbat candlesticks in this image, that's part of an individual story. Somebody held those candlesticks and they used them to celebrate rest. They were brought over from Lithuania by the parents of South Carolina legislator Harriet Hirschfeld Kinserling, and they brought them over to the United States because they identified that their religion, the religious practice, and these candlesticks' history were necessary for their new life. And then the things that get saved and passed down, and they end up in museums like ours, these have these deep and personal stories related to these greater themes. And I'm sure that you have objects at your own home with these deep connections as well. So this is the part where I'm going to ask for some audience interaction as we move into, more immigration stories. I invite you to interact in the chat or verbally, or to just consider your own answer. Where and when, so did your family come into the US? So from where, if you know where they entered, and when did your family come into the US? I'll take 3 verbally, but if you want to interact in the chat, that also works well.
Hi.
Hi.
My grandfather came from Poland. My name is Kelly Richmond, and he started off in Galveston. So that's a little, more unusual. And he worked his way up the Mississippi, went to Chicago, and then ended up in Davenport, Iowa, where other people from his community found their way, and including his older brother. So he left my grandmother and all the kids in Poland and and lived, I know this is so hard to believe, lived behind a steel, he lived in a steel mill in a little room, saving up his money to bring them over. And 12 years later, he went to Poland and got them. Is that amazing?
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing, Kelly.
Yeah, and
What's
then they
even,
came through.
what's even more amazing, Kelly, is that I grew up in Davenport, Iowa.
Who are you?
And I,
And are we related? And are you my rich relative I've been looking for?
I don't think so.
So
but we need to get together at some point. And what was his name? Richmond?
No, that's my married name. His name was Greenswag.
Greenswag.
And who are you? And what was your name?
My maiden name is Slivken, Slivken, and we actually came down from Canada to Dubuque and then Davenport and Rock Island.
Wow.
My generation now is well, everyone is gone now from that area.
Of course.
But
me too. Me three.
Yeah.
You know what? I don't know how I can. I'll have to find a way. I'll speak. You know what?
We'll make the Jewish Museum help us here. I'm sure we'll get us together. Right.
It will connect you all. Don't worry.
Wow, I am so happy I spoke up.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing your stories. We'll have time for one more story.
Well,
Alice?
My own grandparents represent the two Ashkenazi immigration stories, one from Central Germany and one from Eastern Europe and Russia. But my husband's family, he is deceased, but his grandparents came from Russia initially and settled in Rochester, New York. And then his maternal grandfather and grandmother decided to move west, actually, and ended up in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm sorry, St. Joseph, Missouri, which is where my mother-in-law was born. And then he left the family there and went off to be a beet farmer in Wyoming when they were doing, land grants. So he did that for a while, and then eventually the family reconnected and came back to Rochester, New York. So there was this moment in time when some of the family was in St. Joseph.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing, Alice. And I'm hearing all these different ways people got into the United States. My family came in through Angel Island in San Francisco. But we most typically hear the story of Ellis Island as a way to come in. And so we like to show places in the South that had a lot of immigrants. And like Kelly's family, the trunk you see in this picture came in from Galveston, Texas. So around the turn of the 20th century, many immigrants came in through Ellis Island, though not all. Around 10,000 Eastern European Jews came in through Galveston, Texas, which is how it got its nickname, the Ellis Island of the South. And bringing Jews in through this port city wasn't happenstance. It was actually by design of other Jews living in more populous landing spots. So in these more populous landing spots, like New York City, there was growing anti-immigrant sentiment. And so people like Jacob Schiff, who is a businessman and philanthropist, helped develop and fund a program in which new immigrants would come in through Galveston and be supported by Jewish organizations. So this gentleman, right, I hope you can see my mouse, this gentleman right here, this gentleman right here is Rabbi Henry Cohen, and he helped to work to get immigrants to find new homes in the interior of the country. And so a fair number of Jews in the Midwest and West, and I guess also New Jersey, can trace their family history through trace their family history coming in through the port of Galveston. This trunk in particular came in 1905 with Rachmel, or he later went by Robert Shapiro, and he immigrated to the United States in search of political freedom and to avoid transcription into the Russian army. So Shapiro's journey included secretly crossing the Russian border before gaining passage on a ship departing from Bremen, Germany, and then landing in Galveston, Texas. No, that one's the right one. So Jewish immigrants in the 19th century often journeyed beyond port cities like Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans and into the frontiers of Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. And they often arrived with little to no wealth and found work as peddlers and merchants in the interior of the American South. Advances in the railroad transportation, as well as seizure of Native American lands, the clearing of forests and the draining of swamps, and a booming cotton industry built upon the labor of enslaved people all led to the founding of these new towns. And these outposts, which were eager for general stores and supplies, often counted Jews among their first residents. As the towns grew, Jews found themselves intimately invested in the development of the American South. So now that we've established how and why Jews came to the American South, let's talk about some of the ways they made a life in a section that we call Navigating Southern Spaces, which refers quite literally to getting around and finding a new home, but also to this idea of becoming Southern. Because we focus on diversity and acceptance here at the museum, I want to talk about this complex identity space that Jews at this time were a part of. And I use this time to read directly from one of the labels we have in the gallery to help us understand Jewish identity was formed in the South at this time, specifically in relation to the racial hierarchies of the period. So Southern Jews' acceptance into white society was conditional and complicated. They faced discrimination, as did other ethnic groups, including Italian, Irish, and Asian populations, albeit in varying forms. Nevertheless, Southern Jews benefited from a system that forced African Americans onto the bottom rung of the racial hierarchy. Southern Jews enjoyed opportunities economically, socially, and politically that were unimaginable to African Americans before, during, and after the Civil War. Many Southern Jews turned a blind eye to racial injustices that benefited them. Others directly contributed to these injustices by owning enslaved peoples or through supporting a political system that kept African Americans in various forms of enslavement. So from here, let's talk about how Jews interacted with slavery in the pre-Civil War era. Let's acknowledge that it was complicated and there were a lot of different perspectives. In the pre-Civil War South, Jews owned enslaved peoples at the same rates as their wider Southern society. In the museum, we have the bill of sale of a young enslaved person called Harriet, the Kara Weisberg in Arkansas, which is on the left. And on the right is a $2 bill with the face of Judah P. Benjamin, who was the first person in the Jewish person in the U.S. Senate, and then was also a key figure in the Confederacy. He served as Attorney General, Secretary of War, and then Confederate Secretary of State. And his importance is pretty clear. He was on the $2 bill, this important currency that people exchanged in and saw probably every day in 1862 and 1864. And so we know there was this prominence of Jewish people in Southern society and in this Southern identity space. But we also know that not all Southern Jews were pro-slavery. There were some Southern abolitionists like Moses Elias Levy. So why do we tell this story at the museum? One, it's part of the Southern Jewish experience. Retelling and acknowledging these histories is so important. And we can't shy away from uncomfortable stories or try to tell a single narrative. One of the things that I find really interesting about museums is that they are, on the whole, trusted institutions. People rate museums among some of the most trusted institutions, far above politicians in the news, just below family. And a way we build that trust is to ensure that we're telling these multiple perspectives from the past. We're creating this intricate story of the past that is as complicated as the present. So just like I'm talking about, there are multiple histories happening at once. So before, during, and after the Civil War, Jewish people were also quite literally navigating the land, working to make a living. One of the most pervasive ideas of the Southern Jewish experience is that of the peddler. The peddler went town to town selling his wares, and he was welcomed into these small communities, many of which were too small to have their own general store. In these peddling experiences, we get some really unique stories. And in this article that I'm about to read from, and then from the New Orleans Crescent in July of 1860, we learn about the daily experiences of peddlers. And it could be a challenge from some peddlers. Take a listen to why it might be a challenge. So the Crescent reports that the fare is bacon and bread for breakfast, bacon and bread for dinner, and some bacon and bread for supper. We have bacon on the table and under the table. So while some peddlers were not religious, others needed to be creative to meet the challenges of observance on the road. Southern Jewish peddlers often set out on Sunday or Monday and returned home by Friday to rest and pray for Shabbat, where only treif or non-kosher foods like ham and pork, even vegetables were available. Some Jews carried boiled eggs, while others ate what was served. So the experience of the peddler was not uniform. Some peddlers made it. They accrued enough capital to start their own merchant store. Some merchants made it. They accrued enough capital to start a department store, but many others failed. And they took up a wide range of other professions. So the next thing we talk about in the museum is the story of merchant stores. And it's really complicated. And I wish we had more time to go into it. But when you come to the museum, I invite you to spend some time reading about the individual stories of merchants, from butchers to dry goods to clothing and shoemakers, as this makes up part of the Southern Jewish experience. I'm going to pause right now because I think I see Larry's hand up.
Yeah, thank you for recognizing. I was interested in your comment on Jewish slave ownership in the South. You said was about the same proportion as others in the South. Would you have any idea of what was the ownership of plantations compared to, like you say, merchants and other things? You tend to think of the Jews as being not so much in the plantations, but more in the merchant class. So that kind of surprised me, that they owned slaves, even though they were, not working plantations. And I don't know if Louisiana, of course, famous for rice, had its largest slave population. We're in South Carolina right now, right in the outskirts of Savannah. So we're very familiar. We're members of Congregation Mikveh Israel, as a matter of fact. So we're right down the road from Savannah. Thank you.
Awesome.
Lizzie,
Yes.
another Larry speaking. So one of the interesting stories is we live in New Jersey, and my wife was teaching in a local area school, and somebody who had the same last surname that we had, the last name is Gurman, G-U-R-M-A-N, contacted my wife, and we got together, the two couples, to find out if there were any connections, relationship, for family. Well, that wasn't the case. This gentleman, who was a little older than us at the time, related a story that when he was 18 years old, he went into the Navy. It was the end of World War II, and he was stationed in San Diego. And what he did, which is quite common with people whose name isn't that seen, he went to the phone book to see if there were any other Gurmans around. And again, he was 18 years old, so he went to a person's door, knocked on the door, and the person opened it and said, "Well, hello, why are you here?" And it turned out this was a Black gentleman. And so this individual said, "Well, I'm here because I wanted to see if we had any family relationship." And the gentleman, this African-American gentleman, said, "Well, my family took the surname of the slave owners that owned us at one time," which again is not the story of my family. But again, it just shows here's something where it made a connection with me in an amazing way that I would never have expected. So sort of interesting.
Thank you so much for sharing, Larry Gurman. And yes, that is true. So there are African-American people who trace their lineage back to the American South, to Jewish slave owners, or to slave owners who had their same last name. As Larry R., for your exact question, I don't have, it's actually part of our internal research to figure out the percentages, to try to get a handle on the number of Jewish plantation owners. Anecdotally, I can say that Judah P. Benjamin owned a plantation in Louisiana, in Belle Chase. He sold it before the war, but he owned a plantation. I happened to be at my desk today and oh wow, my virtual background does not like this book. This is called Jews in the Civil War by John Sarna and Adam Mendelsohn, or edited by John Sarna and Adam Mendelsohn. And it's a great resource to learn more about Jewish people in the Civil War, as well as one other organization called the Chappell Manuscript Foundation. And they're working to identify every Jewish person who fought in the Civil War and the Union and the Confederate side. And one of the things they're also looking for is if like the number of Jewish Confederates and actually Union members who own slaves. So I can't say that I have an exact answer, but I do know that hopefully in the next few years, we'll have a better handle on that exact question. So thank you so much for asking it.
Lizzie, can I bring up something again? You may know about the Yale University series about Jewish lives, about 189 books about different people. It's a brilliant series. And the latest one that came out was about Judah P. Benjamin. And there have been some, I've seen some book reviews where the argument is that Judah P. Benjamin was perhaps the most prominent Jewish person in American life in the 19th century. I mean, he was a brilliant man. He was a charming man. And you talked about his background. Jefferson Davis turned to him, and as others did, and he became vice president of the Confederacy. And it's amazing, of course, as you know, that when the war ended, he fled to London and created another career as a barrister. But it's really fascinating to realize that someone reached that high a level of position, you know, in the American South.
Absolutely. Yes, we actually sell, I recently finished that book. We sell it here at our museum store, and I kind of got into the history of Judah P. Benjamin. He's a fascinating character, and I also invite you to read more. That being said, I see the time and I want to make sure we keep going because we haven't even gotten to the 20th century yet. So we got some places to run. So the next story we talk about at our museum is this idea of votes of inclusion and an age-old prejudice. So these are two strands of the Southern Jewish experience, of Southern Jewish life, that exist and converse with one another. And I'll start with votes of acceptance. So you see a map, and I'll get a close up on the map. The map you see, the red stars represent a town with one Jewish mayor, while the blue stars represent a Southern town with more than one Jewish mayor. So take a moment to consider why does this matter? And I'm just going to let everybody take a few moments in their head and then share our perspective. Why are we counting Southern Jewish mayors? So I think about this as a true indication of being part of a community. You don't become a mayor in a vacuum. You don't become a mayor in a place where people don't accept you. And another popular question that happens around now is, well, do those towns have really high representation of Jews? Is this like a little Jewish town in the middle of the American South? No. In these towns, most often, about 1% of the population might have been Jewish, maybe even less, perhaps slightly more in some, but mostly less than 1%. Certainly not enough to get you all the votes that would take you to be mayor. And so this is an indication that there were Jewish Southerners who had built enough social capital in their towns to become mayor, and they had this important civic interest. So they were accepted community members. But I also talked about this other story, this age-old prejudice where we talk about anti-Semitism. So we know that there's a flip side to this acceptance, right? And the following image that I'm going to show can be jarring for some people. And I want to let you know that it's an effigy before I pop it on. So the historical record, that we have a historical record of stories of anti-Semitism in the American South. Perhaps the most famous is that of Leo Frank. He was a pencil factory superintendent who was convicted in the 1913 murder of young Mary Fagan, who was only 13 years old. When his sentence was commuted to life in prison in 1915 by John M. Slanton, a mob broke out and broke Frank out of jail and lynched him. The image you see is an effigy of John M. Slanton, the governor, and it reads, John M. Slanton, King of the Jews. So this case was really unsettling for Jews at the time, and it adds to our complex understanding of the Southern Jewish experience. We can see that the South wasn't inhospitable to Jews by looking at the experiences of Southern Jewish mayors, but we can also see that Jewish identity was fraught. So the next, we're going to keep rolling.
Can you
through
please repeat his name?
Frank.
So the person who was lynched, his name is Leo Frank. The governor is John M. Slanton, the governor of Georgia. So let's keep going. So the next theme we focus on at the museum is this idea of institution building, how Jewish Southerners built Jewish community through securing burial grounds, raising funds for synagogues, and establishing schools. And in part, this sets Jewish people apart from their non-Jewish counterparts, and that they're literally creating spaces away from others for Jewish youth. But on the other hand, it's so Southern, as they establish places of community centered around religious experience, just like their Christian counterparts and the importance of church in the South. So this is this institution building idea. And I'm going to talk about it in this one particular way with our community quilt. So this quilt was stitched by the Sisterhood of Temple B'nai Israel in Canton, Mississippi in 1885. And it speaks to many experiences. First, it was likely part of a fundraiser. So it was raffled off and had women coming together to support their synagogue. Something that maybe you or your family has done. And people would come together and they would stitch a part of themselves into this larger work. And it also points to ways that these communities were insular, because during this time, this crazy quilt, there's a crazy quilt craze sweeping the nation, say that 3 times fast. And it was in reaction to the prevalence of the sewing machine. So the sewing machine allowed people to efficiently sew small, delicate, replicatable stitches really easily. So that type of stitch work became less popular. It was less impressive. So instead, these different type of stitches, these crazy stitches, like the ones used to make this quilt, those became the coveted stitch work. And groups from all over the world would come together to sew quilts like this. So it means that the Sisterhood in Canton, Mississippi was dialed into this really popular trend. And then here at the museum, we ask our visitors to consider this metaphor of stitching themselves into the Southern Jewish community on our digital quilt table. So each of us is unique and identifiable, yet when we come together, we create something complicated in this larger, beautiful picture. And this interactive table has become a very popular stop at the museum, and I hope that one day you'll be able to add your own square to our quilt. The next place we're going to roll to is our gallery outside of time. We call it Foundations of Judaism. So at the museum, we welcome everyone, whether they're Southern and Jewish, Southern, Jewish, or none of those combinations. And this gallery creates an opportunity to learn more about Judaism as a religion for those visitors who want to learn more, but also how Jewish ritual objects have their own lives and experiences and meanings in our Southern context. In this gallery, hanging above visitors, are 50 replica windows, stained glass windows that represent 18 congregations from the Southern region, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox schools that allow us to think how art that adorns our holiest places looks different. So some windows are representational. They show us trees and Jewish stars and menorahs. They're quite identifiable. But others abstract stories from the Torah and key Jewish concepts. And it helps us think about the many different ways Jewish art looks. This object, this is a tallis or prayer shawl, and it's on loan from the museum from the Lamb and Sorth family of Cary, Mississippi. So the cotton used to make this tallis was grown on the family's farm in Cary, and when the family has need for it, like a bar mitzvah or a wedding, it goes back to them to be used. And it reminds us that objects in museums can and should be used in cultural context. They don't necessarily have to be these static things that are behind glass. This tallis, however beautiful or unique, it was intended to be used and to wrap someone in prayer and community. So when we have objects like this in a museum collection, it's critical to keep the cultural use at the forefront of our minds. This is another opportunity to test out your Southern Jewish knowledge. Actually, it's not even Southern Jewish, it's just cultural Judaism. We have an interactive where people can learn more about Jewish holidays and test out their knowledge of Yiddish. So many visitors to our museum are surprised to learn they know quite a bit of Yiddish as part of their cultural milieu. Let's do a little bit of Yiddish knowledge as well. So choose the Yiddish word that fits best. You're not going in those pants. I can see your, is it A, bubby, B, shtick, or C, tuchus?
Tuchus.
Tuchus. It is C, tuchus. Awesome. Our next one, he never has solutions. All he can do is A, oy vey, B, kvetch, C, gorsnitch. This is the word that last one. So is it?
Fetch.
It's kvetch.
Fetch.
Yes.
Now, all he can do is kvetch, oy. And our last one in our Yiddish test, I had to blank the children from soccer to ballet to the
Schlep.
library. Is it? So
Schlep.
I heard A,
Schlep.
schlep, not mamala or kfel. I had to schlep those kids. Awesome. Thank you so much. And when you come to the museum, I bet you will get I think it's 6 out of 6. Awesome. So now we're going to keep rolling into the 20th century. We made it to the 20th century, just 122 years to go. So on our timeline in our 20th century gallery, we include the experiences that Jewish Southerners have that match the triumphs and struggles to their neighbors and fellow Americans at the time. And this includes World War I, the Spanish flu, the Great Depression on this national and international landscape, and the impact of the boll weevil on the Southern economy. If you're saying, what's a boll weevil? You are not alone. A boll weevil is a beetle that feeds on cotton buds and flowers. And in the 1920s, it infested all of the US cotton growing area and devastated industry and people working in the American South. In the museum, though, we focus specifically on these 2 landmark histories that deeply impacted the Southern Jewish community, the Holocaust and civil rights. Outside of our Holocaust gallery is this image of Ernest Spiernski and his students. And I love this image because it leads us into the Holocaust gallery and then the civil rights gallery and creates a really clear connection between those 2 stories. So Ernest Spiernski was a German Jewish professor who fled Germany in 1937. And though he was qualified to get jobs in university across the United States, he faced anti-Semitism in hiring practices in higher education. He was welcomed, however, at Tougaloo College, a historically Black college in Jackson, Mississippi, where he taught students about war and peace, as you can see right here. We don't know exactly the conversation that Spiernski and his students were having when this picture was taken, but we can empathize. We can assume that they had these shared pasts. For Spiernski, his experience is oppression in Nazi Germany, and for his students, the experience of growing up in the Jim Crow South. So this image succinctly communicates the shared connection between the Holocaust and civil rights stories. The next slide is a black square, and I know it, so I'm just that's one of the things that comes up a lot. In our Holocaust gallery, we tell the story of the Holocaust from a Southern perspective. So Southern Jews served in the US military. They had families and loved ones in Eastern Europe. Before, during, and after the Holocaust, Jews escaped as refugees and survivors and made their home and life in the American South. So we focus on experiences of individuals in this gallery, highlighting a person from one of our 13 states. And when you come to the museum, there are also oral histories, and I'm going to play one of Anne Levy. And keep Anne in your minds. She settled in Louisiana after escaping Eastern Europe.
I was worked at this time already.
Oh. Let's see if this works. Oh, interesting. So this is, as this is buffering, I will drop the link of Anne's story in the chat at the end. Because Anne talks about her experiences in the Civil War, in Jim Crow South, watching young or Black people who are older than she was, having to sit in the back of the bus or not get a seat at all, while she had to stay seated. And she was reminded of the oppression of her experiences in Germany. And I'll drop the link at the end. It's a really powerful story, and I don't know what's happening with my text. Which brings us to our Civil Rights Gallery. So this gallery communicates various perspectives that Southern Jews had of civil rights. And throughout this gallery, we see Southern Jews who openly supported segregation, while others worked actively for civil rights, and even more people sat silently on the sidelines of history. One of our interactives in this gallery is a never-before-heard perspective of rabbis serving in Southern Jewish communities at the time. And I hope you get the chance to come to our museum and listen to this interactive, because they tell a really complicated story of what some Jews felt and did during the civil rights movement. You aren't supposed to play favorites with artifacts in a museum as a museum professional, and the images you see on the screen are my favorite artifacts we have in our museum. These are letters written to the rabbi of Congregation Beth Israel in Meridian, Mississippi. It was bombed in the early morning hours on May 28th, 1968. And these letters of support were written by local children who attended Catholic school. And I love these letters for a few reasons. First, we see general support of the Jewish community following a tragedy. But we also hear from children, what they were thinking at this time, and how they were feeling, and how they knew that they could be supportive. And I then think of the children who come to our museum, who see these letters written, and see that their voices mattered in the past, their voices continue to matter today, and they have agency to support others. So these are my favorite artifacts in our museum. And then I want to bring us back to Anne Levy. So her story, the one that the tech wasn't working for whatever reason, she also uses her experiences to stand up to hate decades later. So she stood up to David Duke, who was a longtime Klan leader and a radical right extremist who ran for governor of Louisiana in '91. And she used her experiences as a child Holocaust survivor to confront Duke's Holocaust denial during his run. And ultimately, Duke did not become the governor of Louisiana. So the last little bit, I have one more thing, and then I'll open it up to questions. So as this idea of the transformation of the rural South, as children and grandchildren moved away from towns in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas to booming cities like Atlanta, Dallas, and Nashville, small town Jewish communities watched their numbers dwindle. And with them, businesses, congregations, and a specific way of life. Southern Jews moved away for many reasons, including the national trend of urbanization. So while some small town communities experienced twilight, Southern Jews flourished in larger cities like Atlanta, where the Jewish population grew from 16,500 in 1968 to over 119,800 in 2018. Businesses also grew, with Jews in the South establishing giants like Dell Computer in Texas and Home Depot in Georgia. So each generation continues to redefine the Southern Jewish experience. And then this last image, the place that we enter at the end of our museum talks about Southern Jewish experiences happening today. One of the most connectable places of our museum is the idea of summer camp. I'd say at least twice a week, a visitor comes to us and shares that they know somebody featured on this wall, because this is our summer camp sweetheart wall, or people who met their future spouses at camp. It points to the importance of Jewish summer camp as a place for youth to build their Jewish identity and social connections. But as people come to us and tell us these connections, it's also a testament to Jewish geography and just how many people you end up knowing from your movements around the world. So that is the end of what I have to say. And now I'm super curious what questions have come up for you all. Feel free to raise your hand, or if you're not a hand raiser, just come off mute. Alice? I see Alice.
I'm going to tie a question in that's in the chat. How big is the museum? What's your square footage? And how are you supported primarily?
I'm like, I think we're 9,000. That's it. I was like, there's a number in my head. We're 9,000 square feet. So we're not a huge museum. And we are supported primarily through small donations. We have a prominent mezuzah wall from our Mezuzah Society, which is people who donate $1,800 or more, and they send a little piece of their home to us, and we send a mezuzah to them, but primarily through small donations. And this is a great segue. I popped ways to engage up on the screen, so you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever. Become a member is a great way to support us, and then to make it a tax-deductible gift, you can support us that way. So you could also be a supporter of the museum. What other questions do we have?
Do you have any information about Jews and Natchez?
Great question. So
Real settings.
we have actually, this is another link I can drop in the chat. So at the end of our museum, actually right here, in our state by state and
Rabbi Brothwell.
From Aiken to Natchez, we have the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities, which I'm popping in chat right now. So in our 900 square feet or 9,000 square feet, we can't cover every story, but the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities allows people to explore these particular stories of place, and it does a really good job of covering most Jewish towns in an encyclopedic manner. So I can say yes and I can say no, because you can explore it on the encyclopedia. What other questions do we have? Larry Gurman?
Yeah, well, a number of them. I was curious about something that happens in many areas where Jews live, about setting up, as they come into an area, setting up their cemeteries, their fraternal and benevolent societies, and that we are such a philanthropic people with our setting up hospitals, orphanages, being cultural facilitators with museums, art and music museums. Do you follow that area of Jewish life in the South? Well, just the contribution of the Jewish members of the Jewish community in so many of those diverse areas.
Yes, I got a little lost in the history. So yes, we do. This picture is really helping me, kind of. So right behind this wall right here, we have 13 famous Southern Jews from a kind of more contemporary story, where we talk about authors, celebrities, comedians, chefs, where we do talk about kind of Southern Jewish pop culture. So yes, we do. It's in a more contemporary light. There's a few instances in the gallery where we talk about Jewish musicians as well. So yes, yes, we do.
Yes. Lizzie, just a different question. Obviously, we believe that roughly 2% of the American population now is Jewish. And of course, many are concentrated in certain areas, such as the Northeast, where we are, in the New York metropolitan area and a few other urban areas. But I'm curious, do we have any idea in demographics of migratory patterns, let's say, of younger people, for instance, so whose families have come from the South? Do they tend to stay in the South or do they move? And turning it the other way, is there any influx of people coming from the other areas into the South, from the Jewish community?
The movement is a really interesting question. I know we have a document about Jewish demographics of the American South of 2020 by Pew that I probably could find and link in the chat. In terms of transport of like the migration, I don't know if anybody has done that research, but I'd also be interested to find out. So I can't answer that, but you've got me thinking, Larry.
Right. Do you, maybe one more question about the museum in terms of doing research? I know you've indicated you look for stories and input from, different sources. Do you have anybody there doing research or putting together archives and the like in the museum?
Yes. Yes. So we are still collecting, and our curator, Anna Tucker, is doing research. We also partner with Jewish organizations like 𝘛𝘩𝘦 Jewish Studies, which is a university down here, the Southern Jewish Historical Society. So we're part of this larger partnership, in addition to continually collecting stories to add to our own collection and our own archive. So thank you for sharing. And then I see Judy is off mute. Do you have a question?
I really wanted just to make a comment. My mother and her family, the Bermans, Alice, the Bermans, went to Houston, first to Galveston, then went to Houston in about 1920. And many of them are still there. Now, her dad came with a beard, a pretty long beard, and was told pretty soon after they got there from fellow Jews that they think it would be advisable if he would cut off his beard. And he did open up a dry goods store on Congress Street, I think was the name of it, in what was then downtown Houston, the heart of downtown Houston. But she told me frequently that she could remember when she was growing up, and she was about 10 or 11 at the time that they got there. During her teenage years, the Ku Klux Klan marching through the streets of Houston, and it was a very frightening thing. And she said, the way they saw the social structure, there were whites, there were blacks, and then there were Jews. And the Jews were a separate entity unto themselves. And it was just fascinating. There are still a few members of the family left in Houston or the surrounding area. And, they managed very well over the years. Only my mother married a New Yorker and came to New York.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. And yes, we hear these individual stories often of the KKK, and then the ways the identity changes and continues to change. So thank you so much for sharing, Judy. I really appreciate your story.
Can you hear me? My name is Marilyn Cass. I have a question.
Yes, Marilyn.
Question is, with anti-Semitism rising, have you had any issues with the museum? Do you have a guard there? What is the situation in the area in reference to the rise of anti-Semitism today?
Absolutely. Thank you, Marilyn. So we work closely with the Jewish Security Council, I believe it's a national organization that thinks about Jewish security. We also have our own security measures in place. In part, we keep our front door locked all the time, and we buzz people in. Is one of our many security measures, but absolutely, just like Jewish communities across the United States and Europe, we're aware of the climate we're in, and we're also trying to think, how do we live our tagline, Shalom, make yourself at home, this idea of hominess, of welcoming people in, of creating this Southern hospitable place in that context. So it's a wonderful question. We have measures in place, and we're talking with other communities as well to ensure we're safe, our visitors are safe. And I really appreciate that question.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Do we have any other? Sorry?
We live in a sad world.
I know. It's hard. Thank you for sharing. I see that the time is now 3:03. Are there any final questions? Should we wrap up? I want to find that Ann Levy thing before. I'm going to stop my share and get Ann Levy for you all too.
Thank you. I can't hear you.
I guess she's looking for the link right now. We'll put it in the chat. I can also collect all the links that you shared and send it to everyone.
Perfect.
At the end.
This is right. Awesome. That is the Ann Levy.
To all of this. Okay. Do you want my Zoom, my email address?
I have it. Don't worry, Marilyn. I'll send it to you.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Just want to say that even with all the problems and everything, it makes me smile. I'm happy. I belong to a wonderful race of people. I'm very proud to be a Jew. And just, we're entwined in life in general.
Absolutely. And that's one of the beautiful things about sharing our story, the Southern Jewish story. We all have these connections, and I hope that through our conversation today, perhaps you saw your own story reflected. I know there were quite a few people on this call whose families have Southern roots, and so I so appreciate getting to share with you all today.
Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. It was a great program. I hope to see everyone come to our museum too. We are open by appointment only, and we have journaling programs on Tuesdays and more Zooms. This is just the second installment of the series to tell all your friends about learning at different museums. And it is really nice to see, and how, just because we're on the East Coast doesn't mean we don't have ties to any other part of the United States, especially because the Jewish people immigrated so much and really spread their roots. It allows us to talk more and more now with different institutions.
I think an interesting program would be the Jewish pirates of the Caribbean.
Okay, Marilyn, I'll get you on to some program meetings so we can plan some. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope
Jessica, could I ask a question of you?
Yes.
I noticed you're recording these. Are they going to be available then?
Yes.
Could you mention that, or how we get to see them if I wanted to show it to other people in our temple here?
Great. So I do have all of them recorded. I will be putting them onto YouTube, and I will send you the links as well with all the other links that we had for today. It'll be a nice compilation. All right, everyone, you can share with your friends and families, and we hope everyone is well and safe, and everyone stay warm if you're in a cold area. And fun. All right.
Thank you very much. It was a lovely program.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Lizzie. Thank you.